Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome to the show Joseph Bouchard. Joseph, this is your first time on the show. First of all, welcome. You're a Young Voices contributor, but I assume there are probably a few other hats that you wear. Take just a moment to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Brian. So, yes, I'm a contributor with Young Voices, but I've been a freelance journalist here in Latin America for the last year or so. I've also worked at a variety of think tanks, and I've focused most of my work on Latin American geopolitics and security issues, mostly as it relates to U.S.-China competition.
Okay, and I have to say, I'm looking at an article you wrote for nationalinterest.org about Luisa Gonzalez and how she would be a disaster for U.S.-Ecuador relations. And I don't mean to sound petty, but I'm happy to hear that somebody else besides America is having some intrigue in their presidential politics. Set the stage for us. Tell us a little bit about what has been going on in Ecuador and what has brought her to the forefront.
Sure. So what happened is this guy, Guillermo Lasso, from the center-right coalition of parties, has sort of had his government gone through some problems. He's had to face impeachment proceedings in the Congress, very low approval rating, and that forced him to resign and sort of begin a new election cycle in Ecuador, where it will only be for 2 years until the next election. But it's quite a contentious race between all of the left-wing parties mostly, as well as one center-right party candidate that's about at 15% now. And Luisa Gonzalez has really hit the ground running. She's at 41% of the vote in recent polls, indicating that she'll probably win. There's a lot of candidates running, but she's by far the most, the one with the most name recognition, and she's from the Citizen Revolution, which is a socialist party associated with the former president, Rafael Correa, who was also a socialist president for 10 years.
So what is the attitude of Correa as well as Lasso and Rodriguez? Is she, or Gonzalez rather, is she? Are they all on friendly terms with America, or do they have kind of a troubled history with the U.S. and their relations?
Well, the Correa movement is quite anti-American. It ran on anti-American sentiment back in 2006 and 2007. And the movement has not stopped since then. They've made opposing neoliberal policies very center point of their campaign, opposing the IMF and the World Bank policies, being on sort of less friendly ties with the United States. The United States has been Ecuador's largest trade and security partner for the last few decades, ever since sort of the Cold War, basically. But Lasso wanted to keep that going and sort of had closer ties with the IMF, the World Bank, the United States, had a closer relationship with the U.S. security community, accepted U.S. security assistance to fight the cartels and some guerrilla groups. But Gonzalez and Correa and all of their movement is very much an anti-American one, and her winning would very much change the dynamic of the relationship, again, in favor of a more anti-American stance.
So it seems like we're pretty clear on where these particular politicians stand. What does the average person on the streets in Ecuador think? Are their leadership in touch with them, or do they operate in their own sphere?
Well, sadly, the Correísta movement is very strong still in Ecuador, even though Correa, as president, was very much authoritarian, especially in his last term. He changed the constitution to allow himself to run a third time and wanted to run a fourth time until he was stopped by the Congress and by the opposition. Despite this, he implemented a lot of different social and economic policies to the left, created a lot of public universities, instituted a very robust public healthcare system, and those sorts of policies really resonated with the Ecuadorian people. And it seems like they're willing to tolerate the authoritarian tendencies if that means they can have another term of Correa or one of his henchmen or henchwomen in this case. And when I went to Ecuador and talked to regular people, and I attended some protests and spoke to people on the ground, it sounded like most people wanted Correa to come back and that movement to really be revived.
Now, tell me about Pink Tide. I'm sorry, I have just not been following, Latin American politics as closely. Of China, Russia, Ukraine, all this stuff has been kind of hogging the spotlight. But I had not heard of Pink Tide before reading your article. What's the background on this group?
Sure. So the Pink Tide is basically an informal coalition or movement of left-wing populist governments that started in the early 2000s. With people like Correa, with people like Lula in Brazil, who's back now, and people like Evo Morales in Bolivia, and even Chavez in Venezuela. So it's a very wide-ranging movement, but it's mostly left-wing populism. And after that, in the early to mid-2010s, there was a conservative wave, and now I would say we're back in a Pink Tide 2.0, where left-wing governments are winning elections again in Latin America and really building a coalition to push for social democratic or even authoritarian leftist policies, and as well as anti-American policies in some cases.
So I have to ask this. Are there positives and negatives to U.S. economic power being exercised in that region? I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of, I bet there are probably some people who really don't want the U.S. Interfering, and there are probably others saying, no, we would actually welcome their help. What are some of the upsides? What are some of the downsides of the U.S. exerting influence within that region?
Sure. Well, there's a very contentious past, and people are quite mad at what's happened in the last decades since the Cold War, with the U.S. supporting various dictatorships, coups, interfering in elections. And I would say that's a thing of the past in a lot of cases. And I understand the anger, but I would say that the U.S. No longer does that in an overt fashion as it did before. And in terms of economic power, I would say countries can very deeply benefit from the U.S. being their largest trade partner, from engaging with the IMF. So in Ecuador's case, it was very controversial because when Correa was in power, he actually declined to negotiate with the IMF to refinance Ecuador's debt in favor of a Chinese offer, which was of higher interest and had no possibility of Ecuador negotiating the deal, and actually gave China the power to renegotiate the terms whenever it wanted for whatever reason. So I would say I understand the anger, but in this case, it has actually prevented Ecuador from having a better financial deal.
Talk to me about some of the fallout from Ecuador. I believe that was the embassy where Julian Assange sought asylum for some time there in Britain. Has that soured U.S. and Ecuadorian relations as well?
Sure. I think it revived the fear in a lot of Ecuadorians that the U.S. is still meddling in its affairs and interfering in its politics. And obviously there's security interests involved, and when the U.S. has security interests at play, it will do its best to promote its interests. But I would say that U.S. security assistance has really been beneficial to Ecuador, especially fighting cartels and illegal mining and fishing. And I would say, you can sort of make sure that the U.S. doesn't interfere while also promoting your own security interests by welcoming U.S. financial and security assistance.
So for those of us who haven't been keeping an eye on what is happening, in Latin America, talk to me about what are the nations we should be watching more closely, whether they are operating with America's interest in mind or whether they are actually more antagonistic. Who are the big players that we need to be aware of?
Well, right now there's second-round elections in Guatemala, and it looks like it'll go back to being very unstable politics from now on, even though the country's security situation was stabilizing, to the point of a lot of my American and Canadian friends going to Guatemala to visit. But it seems like that's going to turn. Ecuador, obviously, for what I mentioned before. I would say also Chile, where the left-wing government hasn't been able to amend the dictatorial era constitution. And it seems like the far right will win the next election. Argentina is happening in September as well. That's to follow, where Milei, from a libertarian right perspective, is looking pretty good to win the election. So I would say there's a lot of different political races to look for and to see how that impacts the relationship in the United States.
Well, Joseph, I appreciate you providing some perspective. Like I say, Russia, China, Ukraine and Europe, they've really dominated the news cycle now for some time. So we sometimes forget there's a big old world out there, and in fact, a lot of it a lot closer to us that has great bearing on what happens in terms of our own foreign interests. For people who want to follow you, for people who'd like to either follow you on social media or follow your writing, what do you recommend they do to catch up with you?
I would say follow me on Twitter at GeoPolWonk. Write me a message. Feel free to engage with my content. And thank you for reading my articles.
All right. Again, we're talking with Joseph Bouchard, Young Voices contributor and the guy who's keeping us informed about what's happening in the rest of the world. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. You're going to be hearing some new voices on today's show. That's exciting. Today we are welcoming Akhila Jayaram. Did I get that even close, Akhila? Welcome to the program. I'm so happy to meet you. For people who are hearing your voice for the very first time, would you take just a moment, please? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for having me on the show. So my name is Akhila. I'm a PhD candidate in biophysics, and I also do a bit of politics on the side. So I'm a campaigner with conservative young women, and I'm just here to talk about my op-ed, which you might have read.
I'm looking at your op-ed. It's titled, Yes, We Should Be Building More Tall Buildings in London. And, I live in a place which is actually very rural, but there's a lot of opposition to people building buildings that are too tall. I would have thought that in London, which is such a large metropolitan area, that maybe that wouldn't be a thing, but apparently there's a lot of opposition. What's the story behind that?
So I think, Brian, in the UK, we are stuck in a loop of not building. I mean, there's always opposition, no matter whether it's urban or rural. Residents are concerned about, how the infrastructure is going to impact on their living, basically. So a lot of this opposition comes from current residents rather than future residents or, other people who are doing business in the area. I think it's primarily because they see that building would cause an influx of people, and they think all buildings are ugly and would not fit in with the tradition and the character. So I think compared to the US, the UK still holds on a bit to tradition, a bit more than probably other countries. So I think that's probably the context of why there's been that much opposition.
Well, on the one hand, I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I can understand that. But as you point out in your article, there's a very real need for office space and for laboratory space and even for places for people to live that necessitates there need to be more buildings created. What specifically are the reasons why the height of buildings becomes an issue? Do people worry that it will block their view?
So I think that's one of the reasons, definitely. I think the article that was sort of written prior to mine said that, having tall buildings would block views of St. Paul's Cathedral. So I think people are concerned about that. But my argument is that we already have tall buildings in Liverpool Street. I was there a month ago. We have soaring tower office blocks, so I don't see how building more tall buildings would not fit in character of the area as well. So it's a bit sort of confusing to me, if I may say.
So who gets to call the shots when it comes to making those kinds of decisions that are based perhaps more on aesthetics than on utilitarian concerns? I'm just curious, who is the final authority in making those kinds of decisions?
So I think the way planning policy works in the UK is that local people have a say, which I think is important. But generally this stops development. So it's a fine balance between democracy and development, I feel. Because like I said, the residents of the area don't want to see it grow exponentially, but in some areas we do need that growth. So I think my article is also a call to planning reform in the future in the UK. So trying to maybe centralize things, trying to get these building projects moving forward through some sort of mechanism that currently doesn't exist.
We're in places where the population density is quite high. Certainly it makes sense, to build up more so than out in order to preserve green spaces and just more open space generally. Does this also affect, for instance, you mentioned that if you want people to move here, if you want to see the city continue to grow, these people are going to need a place to live. Is it difficult to find living space in London right now?
I think it is incredibly difficult for young people to find a space. So I think I've read one apartment gets about 70 to 100 applications, and this is within the first hour of the ad opening.
Wow.
So that's the sort of scale of issues that we have at the moment. And it's just increasing. I mean, everyone I know, they're sort of scrambling to find a space, and if they don't, they just live further away. And that sort of limits how much money they spend in the city, how much activities go on in the city. So I think it has a knock-on effect as well.
Does it also strain resources such as transportation? I assume that if they have to live away from the city, that means that the public transportation is likely to be very crowded, in going to and coming from work.
Yes, so I think during commuting times, it's rather crowded. And we also have a lot of train strikes at the moment. We have a train strike happening tomorrow as well. So you can see that it's a tension for young people. I mean, we rely on public transport if we have to commute, and then there are strikes and we can't get into work or study, depending on what you do in the city. So I think it's a lose-lose for young people at the moment.
Akhila, a lot of technology has made it possible for people to work remotely, and I know there are some people, myself included. I live and work in a very rural area where I can work from home, and I have satellite internet, and boy, life is pretty good. But what is it that draws young people to the city? What are some of the reasons why they may need to go to cities like London if they wish to further their careers?
Yeah, so I think in the UK we're seeing a shift to from the remote working style to back to office. I think a lot of these financial services firms, law firms, and also scientific research requires you to be in the office and learn from your peers. So I think that's what we're grappling with. And given the nature of the industries that are in the city, people have to come in. So remote work might work for some people, but I don't think it's going to work as much in the future, given the nature of the sectors that are there in London.
And you make a very strong case that by discouraging the building that could accommodate those who would come to London in these pursuits, it actually has kind of a ripple effect in that it can stifle the prosperity and economic growth.
I think, I guess in the UK, London is where everything happens. A lot of the growth is concentrated. I mean, you have Manchester as well, which is coming up at the moment. But I think most of jobs are in London and the southeast. So hence people tend to come to London. And if you stop growth in that place, it has a sort of knock-on effect for the rest of the country.
Okay. Are there other places that those who find, for instance, finding living space in London? You mentioned Manchester. Are there other cities to which they might take their talents and take their ambitions? I mean, even elsewhere outside of the UK?
Well, I think we are seeing a lot of emigration to Australia at the moment. A lot of young people are saying, London's not working for me. The UK is not working for me. I'm just going to move to Australia. You have the working holiday visa. I think Canada has also extended the eligibility criteria. So I think people will just move away. And there'll be a loss of young talent and young workforce as well.
So whose minds must be changed in order to bring about the necessary reforms that will allow this problem to be addressed, either through building more buildings upward or just expanding opportunities through building more living space?
I think in this one case, the government, the politicians have to really take a stance on this. This is one of the issues that can't be resolved just by the private sector. So we do need some input through policy making. So I think they are the ones who have the final say. to sort this problem.
Does the common person on the street feel just trapped between, the politicians and the situation? I mean, how would the average Londoner feel? Does this feel like someone wants to come in and change my beloved city, or are they okay with the fact that, nothing stays the same indefinitely?
I think it depends on the demographic of the person you're asking. I guess the older people want to preserve their city and the younger people want change. So there's always a tension between the two generations. That's
a time-honored tradition. Again, we are visiting with Akhila Jayaram. And Akhila, for those who want to follow your work or otherwise connect with you on social media, what's the best way to go about that?
I think following me on Twitter is the best. So my Twitter handle is Akhila, AKHILA_Jayaram. So JAYARAM. That's where you can find me.
Thank you so much for your time today. I hope we get to talk again soon.
Thank you, Brian.
Once again, welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. As I mentioned earlier, today you are meeting a number of the new Young Voices contributors. Our next contributor is Victoria Snitzer Churchill. And Victoria, first of all, welcome to the program and welcome to Young Voices. I'm happy to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's really a joy to be here and be part of this new cohort of the program we just started a couple weeks ago. And definitely looking forward to diving right in feet first, like I think they expect many of us to do here. So I've worked in politics on and off in the grassroots primarily for over a decade now. I got started when I was first, back in high school, and I've kind of continued that throughout my collegiate years and my early young professional years, but I've also always had an interest in media, and so those two things don't necessarily always mesh together super well, because when you're doing campaigns, it's always about the candidate, but now just about a year and a half ago, I've recently transitioned back into the media realm full-time, and I'm really fortunate to work for an outlet, a pair of outlets, the conservative startups that are really interested in developing us. So kind of through that, I was able to apply to Young Voices and kind of see where this leads. So I'm excited to be on your show today.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed the article that we're going to be discussing today. This is one you wrote for the American Conservative about how citizenship is a privilege. And, immigration right now is a pretty hot button topic. Of course, there's major concern over what's happening on our southern border. But one of the big concerns that I hear people express fairly often is that even if someone manages to make it across the border without permission, they're here illegally, but they have a child here, that child is automatically granted birthright citizenship. And this is something that you address in your article. What are some of the takes on that birthright citizenship, and what should we be thinking about it?
So my take is that these children should not necessarily be granted birthright citizenship. They should have to earn it, just like so many people that, did it quote unquote the right way have had to do it. I myself am an immigrant. I was brought here at the age of 3 and got naturalized at the age of 14. So kind of my father was the one that officially went through the process, but at the end I could at that age already say yay or nay. I wanted to be a U.S. citizen. I consider America to be my home, because out of kind of my conscious years, I've really known nothing else for living here. But, I think it's a choice that we all make. And I think that it's one that should be a conscious choice. And I think, as I kind of pointed out in the article, whether you're brought here as a toddler like I was, or as a child just a few weeks away from being born, I think you should be able to make that choice, and that shouldn't necessarily be your parents' choice. And, apart from being an immigrant, I'm also married to an immigrant. My husband came to the country for college, and he stayed, and he's also gone through his own citizenship process, and just kind of seeing the parallels, but also the differences because of how I got citizenship versus how he got it. And, when my family was going to the process, it took us 11 years, but for my husband, it only took 5. And so there's definitely a lot of debate, I think, about where we could fix the immigration system. But I think necessarily integrating those people from day one is not necessarily the right public policy choice. And this is something that is being debated. I specifically pointed out in the article that it was Vivek Ramaswamy, one of the Republican presidential candidates, that had kind of put forth this idea, but it's also being talked about among some others in the GOP field as well.
You know, I'm going to paraphrase Thomas Paine here, but he mentioned in Common Sense about how things which we obtain too easily, we tend to esteem rather lightly. And so I want to bring citizenship into the realm of if it's too easily obtained, if it's just a matter of, you know, tag, I'm here, you know, I touched home base, now I'm a citizen, versus, as you mentioned, the process, what was it, 11 years for you and your family, 5 years for your husband? There's a pretty significant investment for those who are willing to go through the right channels in order to obtain their citizenship.
Absolutely. It's an investment, you know, for a lot of people. It's financial. Some people have sponsorship through their employer, which is kind of how my family got here, or are kind of able to take other classes that kind of help them along. But I think it's an investment, not only a financial one, but also an emotional one. You know, I remember being, 8, 9 years old and going to the consulate or the immigration office and, turning in fingerprints and things like that. But I also remember being in 3rd grade and kind of learning about American history for the first time and really realizing what the values that of, patriotism and freedom and being able to really make whatever you want of yourself in this country, which I think is something that I've really internalized. And I knew that I would not be able to have the budding career that I have today if I had stayed. My family is half Russian, half Ukrainian, so definitely interesting time to be involved in politics and the media with everything that's going on in those two countries. But, even my parents asked me, what do you think you would be doing if we had stayed? And I honestly don't know the answer that I would give them, because being here, especially as a first-generation immigrant naturalized citizen, I think that it's really upon people like myself and my husband, who's also involved in the conservative movement as a whole, that, we recognize these freedoms and we realize how fragile they are. And so we bestow it upon us to make sure that these freedoms outlast ourselves and any children that we may have in the future, and really preserve these freedoms for future generations, because we know what it's like to come from places that don't have these freedoms.
Well, I don't want to sound like an open borders kind of person, but I do believe there's room for people to come here. And I think we should be welcoming to people who come here. But at the same time, I want those who come here to have enough skin in the game that they appreciate what this country has to offer. Now, it sounds like you are very much, on the page of, look, there are places out there that are not nearly as desirable as what a person can find here. And I assume that's what brings people here. But again, coming back to if all I have to do is cross this invisible line, out in the desert in order to obtain, the benefits that I'm looking for, I'm not going to have the same, I'm not going to have the same degree of love of country, culture, that sense of patriotism as someone who actually had to learn about it. I mean, you mentioned that it's not just a simple, take this 10-question quiz and you can be an American citizen. You really have to invest some time, and in many cases it's a pretty considerable financial investment for someone to get through all of the legal hoops necessary to become naturalized.
Absolutely. I think that the people that want to come here and make a better lives for themselves, for their families, are absolutely free to do that. In the article, I talk about a kind of imaginary sliding scale of personal benefit as well as benefit to the country. And I think that that's a consideration that people have to make, because maybe your initial kind of instinct for getting out of wherever your country of natural origin is that national origin is that, maybe your situation isn't ideal and you want to make your own life better, your lives of future generations better. But you also have to realize kind of what you bring to the table in the country that you are seeking citizenship in. And, in America, you have to prove that through a million different ways while you're going through the naturalization process. There's obviously a number of different avenues. But again, I think you have to have a holistic approach of, again, what am I getting, but what am I also giving? And, there's a quote of, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I think that's something that we have to remember even today in this debate. Immigration's always been a hot button issue. It's been a hot button issue, since we had Irish immigrants, since we had, French immigrants coming to this country. But also it's become, I think, a much more hot button issue in the past decade or so, from when I've been following the issue pretty closely. And I don't think that's going to change. And so I think it's kind of incumbent upon us to see where we can make the process a little bit easier, a little bit more streamlined for people that want to come here and make their lives better. But we also want to make sure that the process, has certain steps in place that involves kind of a proper vetting mechanism to make sure that the people that stay here actually truly do want to be American, do want to bring their talents to better this country, and hopefully everybody comes out better for it in the end.
Okay, we've got about 1 minute left, Victoria. I just want to ask this question. As an immigrant, I feel like this is a good question to ask you. Sometimes I hear people say, well, why don't people stay where they are and fix their own country? How would you respond to an observation like that?
That is definitely something that I hear as well. And I think, again, you have to think of the balance of, are my talents valued in my country? And for a lot of people, that answer is no. And again, if you are looking to come somewhere like the U.S., you have to ask yourself, what do I bring to the table? And a lot of the times, places like America value those talents more than someone's home country. And so if you're kind of weighing it out, and if America is the place that will value you more, where you feel like, at the end of the day, we all have to have a job. We all have to figure out what we're going to do with our lives. And if that contribution is going to be higher valued somewhere else, I think that should be definitely something that is taken into consideration. And for a lot of people, that's why they choose to come here, because as kind of the tagline of the article reads, if their home country was better, they wouldn't be looking to come here in the first place.
Yeah, and I love that you acknowledge, too. Look, we're not saying America is perfect, but it's just a lot better for a lot of people than where they originally came from. Victoria Snitzer Churchill is our guest. Tell people where they can find you on social media, where they can follow you and your writing.
Yeah, my Twitter is @snits_churchy, so it's a combination of my maiden name and my married name there, and shortened for everybody. And you can also follow us at Young Voices, find us online, find the show online, and I assume our pieces will be linked in show notes and things like that. So definitely check out what I'm up to and what the rest of the cohort is up to as well.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome, and I'm going to make sure I get your name correct here. This is Elizabeth Grace Matthew. And Elizabeth, you've been on the program before. Some folks are meeting you for the very first time. For their sake, take a moment, tell us about who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for having me back. I'm a writer based in Philadelphia. I write regularly for The Hill Opinion. I'm an independent Women's Forum visiting fellow and a Young Voices, of course, contributor. And I write about education, culture, politics, and religion for various outlets. And prior to turning to writing full-time, I spent over a decade in the academy as a writing instructor and professor.
Wonderful. And you have a wonderful article that we're going to be discussing. It's actually your take on a book that I've been hearing about quite a bit on Twitter lately, and that is Senator Josh Hawley's book, Manhood, The Masculine Virtues America Needs. And as I told you before we went on the air, I've seen some pretty hot takes on this. I think you have a little more nuance in your take, but in a nutshell, what is Senator Hawley, what's the case that he's trying to make in this book about a return to manhood and masculine virtues?
Thank you. There have been a lot of less than nuanced takes, I think. And I think, that's true of both the book and a lot of the reactions to it in many cases. So Senator Hawley is noticing what a lot of people are noticing, which is that American men are not doing particularly well right now. They're falling behind in school. They're falling behind professionally. Too many of them are meeting early demises through suicide, through drug epidemics and overdoses. And the professional world has turned such that some of men's traditional professions no longer pay a living wage and are no longer allow access to a middle-class life in the way that they once did. And as men go to college even less than women, that problem is exacerbated in terms of their earning potential. And their general sort of malaise, I think, is a good word to describe at least the majority of men who are not elites, right? Obviously, if you look at boardrooms, and this is one of the sort of points that a lot of folks on the left would make who would criticize Senator Hawley. If you look at boardrooms and top positions, they are still predominantly male. That's not untrue. But I think Senator Hawley is correct that for the majority of men, things are not great right now. And his argument is that this is mostly because we have neglected to inculcate and, in fact, even begun to be hostile to some of the traditionally masculine virtues that he says are things like strength and responsibility and independence and bravery, and that these virtues have been discarded in favor of overemphasis on collaboration and empathy and tolerance and niceness, right? And I think he's largely correct about that. He blames the elites and the educational establishment, which of course is controlled by a mainstream sort of an even extreme leftist interpretation of what children need, right? It's not sort of the modal person who votes Democratic. It's people who are much more extreme than that control a lot of those cultural institutions. And he blames them. And I think that there's a lot that is reasonable about that. And he calls men to rediscover and reanimate these virtues in the face of a society that has become, at least in the educational and particularly the elite spheres, hostile to those values. I think he's right about that. I just think that there's two issues. One being that, it's also incumbent upon men to recognize that they're part of the problem, right? And then also that these virtues have been just as much disregarded for women as for men, and they are just as important to women as they are to men.
Yeah, something you point out, and this is one of the common criticisms that I've seen in most of the reviews of Senator Hawley's book, is he puts on kind of a cloak of victimhood as he tries to make his case. And I know that there are certain quarters in which victimhood is very fashionable. In fact, that's actually kind of an empowering thing. Look at me, I'm a victim. Now you have to do what I say. But it kind of detracts from the point that he's trying to make. Talk to me for a moment, Elizabeth, about how men have contributed to the problem of declining masculinity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem of sort of declining independence and responsibility, which I would kind of dispute that that's masculinity, right? I think that that's adulthood for both men and women. But I think they've contributed to it in allowing themselves to be marginalized and not taking full responsibility, just as, exactly as you say, the sort of fashionable victimology has kind of come for them, right? They're sort of saying, well, you're not letting us, run around enough in school, and then we're expected to be faithful husbands. We're expected to be professionally successful, and I'm just not going to do that. And I think that it's entirely reasonable to criticize the circumstances in which family formation is supposed to happen. It's entirely reasonable to criticize the educational establishment. But at the end of the day, just as many people who agree with Senator Hawley, including Senator Hawley himself, would say it's incumbent upon
Are you still there, Elizabeth?
For certain minorities or anything else, all of that is absolutely true, and the victimhood may be entirely relevant. However, today you have certain choices. You can drop out of school or you can stay in school. You can decide to form a family and try to be a faithful husband and a present father, or you can decide not to do that, right? And these are choices that young men do, in fact, still have. And I think that laying the blame entirely on a society that isn't necessarily helping them do that doesn't serve them well.
No, I would reluctantly have to agree, although that means I have to shoulder some responsibility myself, for contributing to it. Talk to me about your thoughts on efforts to blur the complementary roles between men and women. It seems like there's been a great emphasis on this to the point that really we're actually told in some circles there is no such thing as a man or a woman. There's only gender, and it's a very fluid proposition. Has that contributed at all to the situation that we find ourselves in, or is that another part of another problem entirely?
Yeah, I think it absolutely has in certain ways. And I think that, on the left, you have people that basically want to elide the differences between the average man and the average woman. And they want to not believe that there are differences in the ways that men manifest strength versus the ways that women manifest strength, at least on average, right? That women tend by nature, again, on average, to be more agreeable, more empathetic. Men tend to be less agreeable, more aggressive, right? These things are true. And to deny them is to deny men the necessary tools to develop into adult men, right? And I think that's been an enormous mistake on the left. One of the problems in managing our reaction to and contextualization of and overcoming that mistake is that on the right, instead of kind of saying what I just said, a lot of folks are saying, well, women are like this and men are like this, and virtues like strength and responsibility are otherwise known as masculinity.
The manly virtues.
Really, right. And I think that's really infantilizing to women, right? What manner of mothers are going to raise such responsible men if they themselves are basically emotional and weak and sentimental, and they can be those things because, of course, they're not men. I don't think that's a reasonable thing to think, or a reasonable way to inculcate the types of virtues that we want in both our boys and our girls. And I think that the left has to recognize that boys and girls are going to manifest those virtues on average differently. And the right has to recognize that girls are not to manifest them any less than boys if you want a healthy society.
Interesting. Okay, so let's we've got about a minute or so left here, but if we were giving advice to our kids, and I mean our sons and our daughters, let's give kind of a thumbnail sketch of what's the best advice parents can be giving their kids to make sure that they don't get caught up in that mindset of victimhood.
That's a great question, and I have three of them, so I think about this a lot. I think it's mostly that, you are not responsible for the context in which you live, but you are responsible for how you handle it, right? So your job is to use your talents and to conquer your faults, to make yourself as useful as possible to others. And that's true for boys and it's true for girls, and it will look different for the average boy and the average girl, but the core advice is no different.
I like it. I mean, I don't know if it's an outright call for a little more stoicism, but I think we could all do a little bit better to, again, manage our responses more so than I need to change the circumstances of everything around me. Unfortunately, we are up against the clock here, but again, we're talking with Elizabeth Grace Matthew. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they follow you online?
Thank you, Brian. I'm at Elizabeth G. Matt on Twitter, and my website is also linked to my Twitter account where you can find all my work. And thank you so much for having me back on.
Great to hear from you.